Hi everybody, my name is Anthony DeOrsey and I'm the Research Manager at Cleantech Group. Joining me here for this discussion is Selene, our Lead Associate for Energy and Power. We're here to discuss some of the dynamics around distributed energy resource, DER, management, and some of the things that are changing today. So Selene, I think as we all know, distributed energy resources, and this can be solar and storage, most notably electric vehicles right now, they're rolling out at scale. Thousands, soon millions around the world, and utilities don't own them. This is going to represent a sea change in the way that energy is stored and managed on the grid. At the moment, there might be varying levels of interaction that the grid operators have with these DERs. And really what this does is this helps them to avoid having to fire up a peaker plant. What do you think that ultimately this is going to mean in terms of a material change in operations for the grid and ultimately perhaps for consumers as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, effectively, having 30,000 or 30 million households in the grid that have solar panels on the roof, and obviously also industrial consumers. I mean, we've seen Google and Facebook and Amazon put solar panels on their roof. That's all the kind of load that would otherwise come directly from the grid. So obviously this means that now these customers are not necessarily always taking this power from the grid. They will take this power from the grid when the solar radiation is low or wind isn't really blowing. But that basically means that the DSO and TSO have to now manage a huge amount of volatility that comes with this additional resource, and that also means that they have to figure out methods how to then have backup power in case there's no solar or no wind. And typically the way I guess it's currently managed is just using batteries or peaker plants, as you said. So peaker plants is something that you can ramp up very quickly in response to intermittent renewables. So there's a number of ways you can balance the power, but the problem with that is that renewables can drop off really quickly. So you can't really have. You need to have specific balancing mechanisms there. For example, you can't really have a coal plant or nuclear plant balancing renewables because they just don't ramp up quick enough. Power. There's also another element. Not all grid operators and DSOs allow for this power to participate in the overall power grid. So in the US, there's only maybe a handful of power grids that allow for this, which just effectively means that you use the power that you have. If you have a home battery, then you store the power there, and if not, then that power is just going to be curtailed, and that's it.
We're sitting in California right now, which is one of the ISOs that actually allows for participation in the grid. So for those consumers that want to opt in, they've got a number of options now. There's technologies like virtual power plants, which would pull together large amounts of distributed assets, aggregate them, sell it back to a utility. There's different types of DER management tools that the consumer or even indeed the utility could use to calibrate the usage of a DER. What do you think is ultimately going to happen in the markets where this is allowed? Do you think that we're going to see utilities really play the most critical role, or will there be an awareness on the consumer side of what choices they have? Will they prefer the tools that put the choices in their hands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, this conference we've heard about the example of Australia, and I know that you've done a lot of work also on looking at Power to X and how potentially your EV battery can be used to charge the grid, say during a time of high demand. You perhaps know that you don't really need to go anywhere, and you can afford to offload that grid, that power from the battery to the grid, and get compensated for this. So I guess the general consensus is that the fact that now that the DR is so kind of wide scale. People will become shareholders of the power system rather than stakeholders. So they will also look at stuff that when is the power price expensive? When does it make sense for me to sell the power back to the grid? So yeah, I do believe that they will probably also take a more active interest in issues anything grid.
Mm-hmm. And I think another thing that we're going to see happen is EVs are going to roll out at scale. We've just hit the quote-unquote tipping point in the US where 5% of all new vehicle sales were electric vehicles. What do you think this is going to mean for the remaining 95% that's still going to be electrified? You're going to have massive distributed capacity in people's homes.
Yeah, I think this is a source of concern and anxiety for DSOs and TSOs alike, because I don't think that there's currently enough infrastructure to cope with such an influx of new consumers in the shape of the EVs. So I get, but then if it's your car, it's up to you how you charge it, right? You can't really demand that the state charges it for you, and most of the EV charging is actually done at home. So that's obviously where the whole DR picture comes together, because then you would prefer to charge it at home over maybe charging it in a charging point.
I think that's something we found through our research too, is that although you hear a lot about the need for public infrastructure, and that's true, and you hear a lot about range anxiety in electric vehicles, ultimately 80% of charging is going to happen at home. That's the estimate. The average American trip every day is 40 miles total. Most people only drive about 9 miles to work. So charging will be manageable at home. And ultimately, what I think we want to understand a little bit better is when you've got all of this plugged into the grid, what is this going to mean in terms of how the economics change? Where does the utility potentially need more options to keep their business model continuous, and for consumers as well, to see the total cost of ownership of that vehicle to go down?
Well, I guess so. The job of a utility and TSO effectively is to provide stability to the power grid. So if a consumer chooses to go for a distributed solution, which probably is more expensive at the moment, it's still more expensive than taking the power to a grid. That is effectively on consumer. However, they are still part of that balancing picture. So I personally would say that there would have to be like a fee or a cost that the consumer pays for certainty that if the solar drops off, that the utility or the TSO has enough money to invest in alternative options, and also to make those alternative options to develop these business models that would be attractive to long duration battery developers or hydrogen developers. So there would actually be attractive business models there to for those companies to work with.
And what I'd like to wrap up is that we've talked a lot about the climate mitigation benefits. There's potentially a huge adaptation benefit here. You've got distributed capacity, there's backup power, there could be some type of pre-planning either for charging a battery, a vehicle, before a storm, before some type of disaster, so that you're seeing less downtime. How important do you think that this is going to be both to the grid and then ultimately in the minds of consumers? We see even Ford marketing the F-150 Lightning as being a source of significant backup power. So I think this awareness is just coming online for consumers. But
I mean, yeah, that will be a massive a massive thing to look out for. But also it means that so if there's a potentially like an adverse weather event and people, or like say for example ambulances if it's an EV ambulance, maybe sometime in the future, if they're charged up, or even if the private cars are charged up ahead of a storm or ahead of a potential major disruption, that just takes that load off the grid, which means that it's more likely that you will have power available for those essential services and the things that you really need to keep running during the adverse weather events.
Absolutely. I think that's all the time we have for today. We could talk about this all day, and indeed we do. So we hope you'll join us at future forums. We hope that you'll engage our research team. We love to talk about this stuff, and we love to hear from you as well. So thank you very much, Selene.
Thank you, Anthony.